The Swedish were sent out and they attacked air bases and basically managed to destroy a lot of the aircraft and infrastructure there.
This is Cold War Conversations. This episode is dedicated to Glenn Towler, long-time supporter of the podcast, an aviation enthusiast. He passed away suddenly a few weeks ago. Blue skies, Glenn. The Cold War years were a period of unprecedented peace in Europe, yet they also saw a number of localised but nonetheless very intense wars throughout the wider world in which air power played a vital role. I speak with former Cold War tornado pilot and acclaimed aviation historian Michael Napier, who has written Flashpoints, Air Warfare in the Cold War, published by Osprey, which describes 8 of these Cold War conflicts. We discuss the wide range of aircraft types used and the development of tactics over a period of revolution in aviation technology and design, which saw some of the most modern technology that the NATO and Warsaw Pact forces deployed. Now, Cold War history is disappearing. However, a simple monthly donation will keep this podcast on the air. You'll get the sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster as a thank you, and you'll bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping to preserve Cold War history.
Hi, my name's Glenn. I'm from New Zealand. I was in the British Army in Germany when the Berlin Wall came down, so I've always been fascinated by the Cold War. This podcast just brings it all back to life, and Ian does such a good job of this. Anyway, keep up the good work.
Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If a financial contribution is not your cup of tea, then you can still help us by leaving written reviews wherever you listen to us, as well as sharing us on social media. It really helps us get new guests on the show. And don't miss details of the book giveaway that will be in the episode notes. I'm delighted to welcome Michael Napier to our Cold War conversation.
These were sort of conflicts that really interested me because I can remember, well, as a kid, I can remember seeing the 71 war going on TV and not really understanding it. The 73 war, again, I can remember quite well from the newspaper reports and all the rest of it at the time. And then sort of rolling forward, obviously aware of the Iran-Iraq war kicking off and going on. And when I was going through my RAF flying training, we were actually training Iraqi pilots at the time, would you believe? To go off and fight the Ayatollah. and obviously at the same time as well, that was when, as I was going through my flying training at Cranwell, I watched used to rush to the news and watch the Falklands War or the news reports from that. So those were things that were in the back of my mind. And I've always had an interest in all those little, I hate to call them little wars because they probably weren't very little really for people who were involved in it. In fact, they certainly weren't. But for in terms of the Great Cold War and everything else, they were sort of almost sideshows. But nevertheless, they were the sort of points of extreme violence, if you like, during a Cold War, which generally kept sort of peace in Europe. So I was interested in that. I was also interested in the fact that we do look upon these as little wars that happened elsewhere to other people. But of course, they happened to real human beings, real people, people's sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, and all that. And so I was interested in the conflicts, particularly from the aerial perspective, because that's my interest, but also in terms of trying to sort of personalise it, if you like. So rather than a sweeping, the Indians flew 50 sorties this day and 3 people got killed. Well, what were they? What did they do? How did they do it? Who was killed? Because I think it's quite important.
That's one of the powerful things in here, because you have a number of eyewitness accounts from each conflict. And I can see in there you've tried very hard to name almost everybody, or as many people as you can, in the particular missions that you describe in there, which I think is right to make sure that these people aren't forgotten for whatever side they were on. I think it's important to remember that there were casualties during the Cold War. It wasn't just a Cold War; it was a hot war in a lot of different places.
I think one of the interesting things also is to place these various conflicts in context of the Cold War. I mean, thinking the Suez, we've got the French and the Brits as at that time kind of superpowers, with the Americans upsetting the Americans at the same time as the Soviets were invading Hungary. In fact, almost exactly the same, almost to the day, at the same time. So this sort of crisis happening, which eventually ends up with it leaving just the Brits and the French sort of being squeezed out. Congo, again, interesting in the early 60s, because I mean that actually coincides pretty much with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also at a time when the UN's actually is taking names kicking ass. It's actually flying combat missions, and I think that's probably the only time that that the United Nations has had its own little air force to fly combat missions. Then drifting through to the Arab-Israeli and the Indo-Pakistani wars, again, it's quite interesting there, seeing how India and Pakistan started off. I mean, just looking at the aircraft, the Pakistani Air Force was virtually all American, the Indian Air Force virtually all British and French. Then rolled it forward to 71, and suddenly the Indians are trying to distance themselves from the British and have sort of got into bed with the Soviets. And at the same time, the Pakistanis are distancing themselves from the Americans, and they've got into bed with the Chinese. And then you end up with the 73 war between the Arab Israeli, and that becomes almost a proxy war between USA and the USSR in terms of equipment and backing each side. Iran, Iraq, again, interesting that we were backing the Iraqis at the time, and it was kind of us against the Iranians, who were pretty much on their own, really. And again, Falklands, seeing how NATO did kind of pull together to help the British out, but also I think that at the time when Britain had just sort of was recovering from the 70s and didn't really believe in itself, and other people kind of looking and going, yeah, whatever. Suddenly that gave us the confidence, and I think also garnered an awful lot of respect around the world. People thinking, well, actually, we do need to listen to these British people, because they are serious players in the world. So, it's interesting to look at these conflicts, but also to see them in the larger context of the Cold War as well.
Absolutely. And, what I wanted to do was just dip into a few of these in a bit more detail. And I think Suez is a really good one to start with. As you say, it can't be viewed in isolation. The Soviet invasion of Hungary was going on at the same time. Hungary had brought in a government who wanted Hungary to become neutral and leave the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviets came in and fought against the Hungarian army during that period. And there were comparisons made with Britain invading another country with the Soviet actions in Hungary at the time as well. Yeah,
that's right. I think the Americans were upset that it was all planned without them knowing. But it was all one of those sneaky things with the Israelis involved as well, with the French. So that sort of Anglo-French and Israeli. And again, one of the interesting things to say, I hadn't realised that the French Air Force were actually operating from Israel. In fact, I think a couple of squadrons actually were pseudo-Israeli Air Force squadron numbers. So it's sort of quite interesting to see that. But one of the other things, and again, about all of these conflicts, is that I found it very difficult myself when trying to read about these things, that to find a book which covered everything and from all sides, because quite often you can find something that tells you about one side but not the other. So and also those tend to be very, very biased as well to whichever side they're telling the story of. I mean, there's a book about the Pakistan, the first Indo-Pakistan War, about the Pakistan Air Force, and it is unbelievably puerile biased, and that's the case of an awful lot of that stuff. And in the case of the of Suez, I found it difficult to find anything that covered both the French and British, but also both the Air Force and the Navy, because both countries had both there. So there was all the carrier-borne stuff happening as well. And again, really interesting to pull all that lot together and see, again, how air power was used. Because, again, the idea was in that sort of classic way that we've, you can put it through to the Gulf Wars as well, where the idea is you go in with the Air Force for 3 or 4 days and take out the enemy air force and establish air superiority, and then you bring in the surface forces. And in fact, that was pretty much the case in down the Falklands as well. So it's quite interesting to see that how that panned out, but also, I say, to have that big picture of it.
There's so many nuggets in the book that I enjoyed. Things that I thought, God, I never knew that. And the Israel at the time of Suez was sort of like on the cusp of the jet age as far as its air force. was concerned. I mean, I was astonished to see that photo of an Israeli B-17 flying fortress.
Yes, well, that's quite surprising, isn't it? Yeah, I think they had about 3 or 4 of them, and this was their sort of bombing squad. But yes, amazing. I mean, the war kicked off with Israelis flying at ultra low level across the Sinai Desert in P-51 Mustangs with wire cutters trailing beneath them, so they could cut the telephone cables. It's always unbelievable, isn't it? Really, but you're right. At that stage, there were all these. Second World War aircraft that they've been handed over, and then of course the early jet aircraft as well. They just started to be able to acquire. Many of them French, but so an interesting mixture of machinery.
And I think the other thing that's pretty unique about Suez is it was probably the last combat parachute drop of the British Army. I would have thought a airborne landing under fire.
I think you're right. Yes, and the French as well, because of course the French. I think the British landed on the western side up at Port Said, and the French landed on the other side. The also thing that surprised me was to find that when the RAF bombers were sent in, they were basically using World War II tactics. So they sent in the Canberras with target marking flares. So they went in and put flares down, and then the bombers went over and bombed the flares. And it seems crazy that 11 years after the war had ended, they were using the same techniques as Lancaster crews and Halifax crews had used during World War II over Germany.
I guess the aircraft had evolved, but the actual munitions they were dropping were still dumb munitions.
That's a critical point, really, because bombing an airfield, an airfield's a big area, and unless you actually get the bombs in exactly the right place, they just make big holes in the sand there or the grass, or whatever. So, and that's the case. Yeah, I mean, I think it was actually it's the weapon aiming. I think was the problem, that they really still didn't have a decent radar system to bomb at night. So it resorted to World War II methods with not very good results, I have to say.
What about the Egyptian Air Force? Did they give a good account of themselves or not?
I think it depends which way you look at it. I mean, I would say they did, in that they were fiendishly clever and realised straight off that they were going to lose if they tried to take on this massive armada. I mean, all these aircraft from the RAF and from the French Air Force based in Cyprus and Malta. Again, aircraft based in Israel as well, and then. The Royal Navy had 3 carriers. The French had 2 carriers. So, it was a very one-sided context. So the Egyptians, I think, very, very smartly thought, right, let's just get all airplanes out of here and pull them out of range, which is what they did. I think there were a couple that floated around. There was a MiG-15, I think, or a couple of them which were operating from road strips and things. And I think one of them did try to engage the Royal Navy aircraft attacking the canal zone at one stage. I think they did. They claimed to have got a kill, but I don't think it actually happened. But they certainly, enemy aircraft were seen, and also a lot of they put a lot of decoys. Actually, a lot of really well made decoys. So again, the French and British, particularly the carrier-borne aircraft that were dropping from low level, were claiming to have destroyed lots of these MiG-15s they'd seen, but they were actually very, very good decoys that had been built. The real airplanes were miles and miles away, well out of harm's way. So I think actually that they were really smart in looking at it. Going, well, there's no point. Let's just pull ourselves away, and then we'll be good to fight another day.
I'd like to spend more time talking about Suez, but the one that I'd heard of it, but I definitely wasn't familiar with much of it, is Congo, 1960 to 65.
That's what I mean. It really interested me, and that's why I included it. So I've already mentioned the bit about the UN having its own little air force, which is an interesting thing. But also, it's really interesting to see how air power works. If you don't need much of it, if the other side haven't got any, and similarly, if the other side does get it and then uses it sensibly, it can completely destroy your advantage. And
can we just explain what the situation is in Congo and why the UN are involved?
So in 1960, or in the late 50s, shall we say, Congo's a Belgian territory. However, the locals are getting more and more unhappy with this, and the Belgian authorities are doing a particularly bad job. And so at the end, in 1960, the Belgians are persuaded that perhaps they should go home and leave Congo to be independent. And so Congo becomes independent, but with, I have to say, tacit Belgian and also British and French agreement, the southeasterly province of Katanga decides that it's going to be independent itself and become the country of Katanga. The British, French and Belgians thought this was a good idea because that's the rich part, the mineral rich part where all the diamonds come from. So obviously thought, well, if they help them out, then maybe we'll win with the diamonds. And that for that reason also, the Congolese turned around and said, well, no, we're not happy with that at all. So basically a civil war broke out, really, between the Congolese army, it's called the ANC, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for, and the Katangese gendarmerie. And at the same time as the whole country sort of started falling into anarchy, the government of Congo appealed to the UN and said, please, can you help us? So a UN peacekeeping force was sent there. I think it's one of the very early UN peacekeeping forces. So they were sent in to try and sort of hold the fort between, stop the conflict, but also to persuade the Katangese that really they shouldn't be doing this. So that's where we were at. And at this stage, the Congolese do not have any air force at all. The Katangese, however, do. They have these de Havilland Dove little light aeroplane, sort of small airliners, and they turn them into bombers by initially sticking a machine gun in the doorway and firing off, but also by getting big petrol drums, putting a grenade in them, pulling the pin, and chucking the thing out of the door. Not very accurate, but if you can imagine you're in a little village in the middle of nowhere, and this thing going off in the middle of the night is going to really scare the hell out of you. And so it's remarkably effective in terms of the hearts and minds, the psychological side of it, of fright, and also frightening the ANC troops as well, because they'd be in their little camps and suddenly there were these bangs going off around them. So that's how things started out. They then got a bit more clever, and one of the local mining companies was persuaded to manufacture bombs. So they made them out of pipes, really, and high explosive, but nevertheless quite effective. And a couple of the Doves were converted to carry these bombs, and they could be released quite accurately. So we've now got the situation where, with a handful of aircraft, the Katangese were able to exert an incredible amount of influence, really, over what was happening on the ground. Really support their own people and upset the ANC troops very, very effectively. And then the Katangese had ordered 9 Fuga Magister trainers, these little jet trainer things, of which 3 arrived, and then the remaining 6 didn't, because there was an arms embargo at that stage. But the 3 that did arrive, one of them, I think they crashed fairly early on. And I should say these are all flown by mercenaries, mainly Belgian mercenaries, but some Eastern Europeans as well. But one was particularly effective in the September of 61, 62, around there, when the peace talks were going on under the UN, under UN auspices. And this one airplane, because it was relatively fast and had carried machine guns and bombs, could flash around and be in one place and drop a couple of bombs here and then go somewhere else and strafe people. And again, it's almost a reign of terror. This guy, Jose Magen, his name was, a sort of one man band, having this amazing amount of, or exerting this amazing amount of pressure, really, on both the UN people and on the ANC. In fact, it all came to a head when Conor Cruz O'Brien, who was a UN envoy, came out of a press conference with all the world's press there, and again pitched up in his Magister and strafed him. So this picture of the UN man sort of cowering behind a tree, and this really did make the UN sit up and think, well, actually, we need to do something about this. So they appealed for some combat aircraft. The appeal was answered by the Ethiopians, who sent a squadron of F-86 Sabres, the Indians, who sent a squadron of Canberras, and also the Swedish, who sent a squadron of Saab J-29s, sort of first-generation jet fighter. It's called the Tunnan, a barrel. It looks like almost like a sort of jet-propelled barrel. It
does look like a strange sort of look to it.
And and so these guys, particularly the Swedes and the Indians, because the Indians were a bomber aircraft, attack aircraft, and the Saabs, the Swedes could do either, were sent out and they attacked the Katangese air bases and basically managed to destroy a lot of the aircraft and infrastructure there, and that basically put a stop to to Avocat, the Katangese Air Force, for a while. And then, of course, there's a UN operation called Rum Punch, where they advanced into Katanga and grabbed all the mercenaries and expelled them. But of course, the mercenaries then got out and then bought themselves a ticket back again, and were very soon back in the country. At about the same time that Avocat sort of then started building itself up again. Initially, they had some Dornier 28s, little sort of twin-engined light aircraft, high wing thing, which again they went back to machine gun in the door and grenades. And started using those mainly at night again, where they knew that the Ethiopians and the Swedes wouldn't be able to find them. And then they started managing to buy Harvard trainers, the American Harvards, which again could be modified and indeed were modified to carry bombs. They ended up with virtually 9 of these things at one stage and started bringing these into service. At that stage, the UN decided that another attack was required to take them out. Now, by this time, the Indians had gone home, and as had the Ethiopians, and they had been replaced by the Iranians, so the Imperial Iranian Air Force, who sent F-86 Sabres, as did, the Philippine Air Force sent pilots, and the Italian Air Force sent F-86 Sabre aircraft, and the Philippine guys flew the Italian aircraft, if that all makes sense.
It's a veritable United Nations,
was, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then a final sort of attack by the Swedish managed to actually put paid to Avocat and drive them out.
And that's one of the things that I found incredible. I had no idea that the Swedish Air Force had actually attacked an enemy during the Cold War, albeit under the aegis of the United Nations. But never heard of that before.
No, that's what really interested me. That it was this little war had gone on, and it was kind of almost forgotten, really. And so to bring that out, and also to bring in the mercenary side of it as well. A couple of books, which again it's difficult to sort of gauge how exact they are, because I think that the guys who wrote them were sort of trying to embellish their stories and embellish their own importance, really. But again, it's interesting to put those accounts together with the with the Swedish and the Indians, because again, in the UN files, which are all online actually, you can find sort of the combat reports from the Indian pilots and the Swedes as well. So it was really interesting to pull all that lot together, really. And I say to come away with a bit of an understanding of that particular conflict, for want of a better word, but also, as I say, how it illustrated, the power of the combat aircraft, particularly if it's unopposed, it's remarkably effective. But again, if you then have an effective campaign against the airfields, that works really well as well, as the UN demonstrated on 2 occasions.
Yeah, and as we see in some of these other examples as well.
Yeah, we do.
And for those that aren't familiar with this Congo conflict, if you've ever seen the film The Siege of Jadotville, that is the same conflict where the Irish are trying to hold out against the Katangese.
That was one of the resupply for the Irish at that battle was interdicted to a certain extent by the Katangese Air Force. The Magister, I think, was certainly involved in dissuading a couple of UN helicopters from going that way, and they also I think strafed there was a bridge which was over one of the rivers, which again they were able to wreck, so that couldn't be used.
Yeah, I seem to think, I haven't seen the film in a while, but I think there may have been a CGI-generated Magister in that film. Yeah, and certainly, this one aeroplane played an enormous part. I always think with the Magister, it's got a very unusual tail, isn't it?
Yes, like a V-tail, yeah.
Is it Belgian-made? Or
no, it's actually French-made, yeah. French. And of course, it reappears again in the 1960s in Israel, where again it's used for close air support. I mean, an airplane less suited to that, particularly in the sort of the heat of battle going on in the Middle East, is difficult to find. But yep, they were used there as well.
Let's have a quick dip into the Indo-Pakistan wars. Yeah. I mean, you featured 2 of them in here. Why do you feature both of those? Again,
they're interesting from the Air Force perspective. They're slightly different. So the first one in 1965 is interesting because the Pakistanis had a very, very small Air Force, but it was all American equipped. So they had about 6 squadrons of F-86 Sabres, which is their main aircraft type, a couple of squadrons of Starfighters, and a couple of squadrons of the American version of the Canberra, the B-57. So this was this very small air force. It was equipped exclusively with American aircraft and quite modern ones at that. And as a member of, I think, CENTO, which Pakistan was, they had access to American training, British training. And so what you had was a very small, well-equipped and very well-trained Air Force on the one side. On the other side, the Indian Air Force was kind of somewhat larger, but that was equipped with mainly French and British aircraft. And again, it's just interesting to see things like Hawker Hunters, the Folland Gnat, a tiny little thing, which was only actually used in the RAF as a trainer, but there was a fighter variant which was used exclusively by the Indians and the Finns with the other people they managed to sell it to. And then French aircraft, Mystirs and Ouragans and other such sort of stuff. Again, the Indian Air Force, I got the impression, was not quite as effective. It was much bigger Air Force, and I think was probably resting on its laurels to an extent. And I think it got a bit of a shock when the Pakistanis took them on. But it was interesting because I think almost you need to sort of see how that went to understand the later one, the 71 war, because the 65 war was basically about Jammu and Kashmir and the Pakistanis trying to cut off Indian access to it. So that never quite happened. On the other hand, the 71 war was when East Pakistan, what's now known as Bangladesh, was breaking free from West Pakistan. And so that was almost 2 wars, because the revolt and uprising in East Pakistan was being put down by Pakistani troops, and the Indians decided that they would help out the rebels, as it were, and that then triggered the war. And of course, the Pakistanis were on the other side of the country, and they decided that they needed to attack the northwest of India in order to take the heat off what was happening over in the east. So, you kind of have to have that understanding of how the first war had gone, because that very much drove the way that the second one went, particularly on that western front, where it was almost a replay of it was interesting to see. I think the Indians had learnt many lessons, and the Indian Air Force came out an awful lot better than it had out of the 65 war. And again, that's a reflection, I think, perhaps on good leadership. The Indian leadership had realised that things needed to be addressed. On the eastern side, over East Pakistan / Bangladesh, again, there was one single squadron of fighter aircraft from Pakistan up against a whole massive number of squadrons on the Indian side. So, but again, the Indians were very good at taking out the runway, so the Pakistanis could not fly after about day 2, and so that was a sort of very well organised campaign. But also, there is quite interesting, like that. We talked about the last sort of big parachute jump in Suez, but the interesting at Sylhet was in the 71 war was I think probably one of the biggest and may still be the biggest helicopter-borne movement of troops into combat, which happened over in what is now Bangladesh. So lots of quite interesting little bits here and there.
There's all sorts of little nuggets like this in the book, and it's like you were saying about this, taking out each other's air forces on the ground, if possible, that tactic, and that is the same with the Arab-Israeli War in 1967.
Yeah, it is, and the difference really is for both the Indians and Pakistanis had tried to do that, but half-heartedly. We've seen that the UN being quite effective at a very, very small scale in Congo, and prior to that, we saw the British and French being very ineffective at doing it in Suez. So 67 is interesting because the whole premise of it was this preemptive strike to take out the whole of the Egyptian Air Force, and it was remarkably effective. And it was effective because it was, first of all, it was led by very, very good intelligence on the part of the Israelis. Secondly, they made sure they had the right weapons, these so-called dibber bombs, which would actually bury themselves into the concrete before going bang. So they had the right weapons. They practiced it. So I think they had numerous assorted ways of practicing. So all the pilots knew what to expect. And also they were able to employ overwhelming firepower by flying the mission, coming back, turning the airplanes very quickly, and then sending them out again. So I think at one stage the Egyptians claimed that that the Israelis had sort of extra aircraft coming in from America or from Britain or somewhere, but actually it was just they were turning them around very quickly to send them back again, so the pressure was kept on. So it's almost a masterclass in how to run one of these sort of counter-air campaigns, really. Interesting, though, less effective because they'd concentrate on what was happening in Egypt. When the Syrians and the Iraqis then got involved, it sort of didn't quite come together in quite the same way. Although, again, I mean, the Syrians were persuaded to withdraw all their aircraft up to the north out of range, so that worked quite well. But it took a couple of goes at the H3 airfield over in Iraq. And again, the Israelis never quite closed it down as they'd hoped to. They ran a couple of raids there, but it was more, I think, the fact that the Iraqi Air Force wasn't terribly effective at the time, that they were sort of persuaded not to take more of a part in it.
By the 73 war, the Arab nations have sort of learnt their lesson and try and do the same to the Israelis as they'd done in 67.
Yes. And the other thing that had changed a lot, and one of the things in 67, although both sides had missiles, they were not very effective missiles. And so all of the air-to-air kills during the 67 war were with a gun. So it was all gunfights. Suddenly, by 73, missile technologies come on leaps and bounds, and so you've now got very effective air-to-air missiles. But the other thing you've got is very effective surface-to-air missiles. And that was really the strength when the Egyptians started their advance, was they had this umbrella of Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles, which were very, very effective, and took a massive toll of the Israeli aircraft to start with. That's the sort of the dynamic changes quite dramatically. Unfortunately, it does also, once the Egyptians advanced beyond their air or the cover of their missiles, they became vulnerable to air attack. And also, the Israelis had realised that they needed to do something, so they then started targeting the surface-to-air missile sites and started taking them down one by one. Again, it's a sort of battle of the missiles there.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey, Jordan Harbinger here of The Jordan Harbinger Show. Subscribe to the only show that will show you how to apply the world's greatest ideas from the most striking minds. We've got spies and CEOs, athletes and authors from Kobe Bryant to Malcolm Gladwell, Tony Hawk and Howie Mandel, and the chairman of Google, founders of LinkedIn and Instagram, antiquities smugglers, con men, brilliant scientists, national heroes, and even the head of the CIA. Come join and have a listen for yourself. Subscribe right now to The Jordan Harbinger Show, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you're listening now.
One of the things I did pick out of that part of the book, which I hadn't realised, is exchange pilots, where other nations were serving in another nation's air force for example, like training, because I think there's mention of a Pakistani pilot who's serving with the Egyptian Air Force.
He was actually serving with the Iraqi Air Force, and I think it's actually I think it's actually the 67 war. It's interesting. Yeah, he was a Pakistani pilot, and I think he may have taken part in the 65 war with India. He then was on exchange with the Iraqis, found himself caught up in the 67 war, and then he went back and he fought in the 71 war, and I think he may indeed have been an East Pakistani, so he may well have ended up in Bangladesh in the end, and I think he ended up in the Bangladesh Air Force. But yeah, again, his skill, I think, was something which was very, very useful indeed to the Iraqi Air Force in that earlier conflict. But you're right. I mean, the other thing that's surprising was that the North Koreans were involved in the 73 war with the squadron of MiG-21s that were down in southern Egypt, and then all the other air forces, Tunisians, Algerians, or certainly Algerians, and other such nations. But of course, the other thing from the Israelis' perspective, as had been the case in 67, was having to fight a war on two fronts, both up to the north against the Syrians, and then and down to the south and west against Egyptians. So again, being a very small country, they were able to do that. But I mean, in terms of the workload on the Air Force, it was actually phenomenal, really. In terms of the guys having to fly north in the morning and south in the afternoon, or vice versa.
Having to fly that number of sorties in a short period of time must be exhausting.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it was absolutely exhausting. It was interesting, actually. The foreword to the book's written by an Israeli pilot called Itamar Noiner, who I'd come across. When I was researching this, I came across a manuscript that he'd written, which it's on the Israeli Air Force website, and it's well worth reading. It's called 6 o'clock as usual, which is a reference to he'd be in your 6 o'clock as usual because he's a good fighter pilot. But it's written in an incredibly modest way and an incredibly, I'd say, just very, very well written. And that described his experiences flying Mirages in the 67 war, and he's also involved in the 73 war. But the point that he makes is that how we sit here in our very comfortable chairs discussing warfare and history, but it's when you're actually part of it, seeing your friends getting killed, risking your life, being, as you say, having to fly how many missions a day, being utterly exhausted, and knowing that that you might die tomorrow, seeing your houses getting bombed, civilians getting killed, maimed, everything else. It's a very, very nasty business, and again, I think that's something that we, perhaps as military historians, don't really give enough perhaps thought to or acknowledgement of, and so when he wrote all that, I thought, actually, you really have hit the nail on the head there.
There's a really powerful photo from the Battle of Britain of a Battle of Britain pilot, and he looks absolutely exhausted. He looks like he's barely able to stand on his feet, and I think it is difficult to imagine both the psychological pressure, the emotions that you're going through there, and I just can't imagine how you would deal with that. No.
And a particular case, in perhaps of the Israelis, where their very small country, as being in 73, a massive, overwhelming surprise attack was driving them back, and it was looking like maybe their country, their home, might get wiped off the map completely. So one can but can't even begin to understand what it must have been like. But yes, that kind of psychological pressure must be absolutely fantastically hard.
Now, we mentioned in the introduction, we were talking about the wars that you've covered within this book, and the Iran-Iraq war is surprisingly, I think, forgotten.
Yes.
In the history books. Yet, as far as there were millions involved in that, and it was 8 years.
That's right,
of almost trench warfare going on, certainly on the ground anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was very, very basic, and it was again, the Iraqis thought that this opportunity was there to just nip across, because the Iranians, it was just after their revolution taking place, a couple of years before that, so they thought, these wonderful opportunities to nip across the border and annex the bits that we want. Discovered it didn't quite go that way, and then started saying, "All right, let's have let's talk about peace." Meanwhile, the Ayatollahs said, "Well, actually, that's not the way we do business. We will take back what you've taken from us, and we're going to get our pound of flesh as well." And so it became very much certainly from the Iranian political perspective, very vengeful, really. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, on the ground, it was utterly sort of First World War, and people, human wave attacks and all sorts of nasty, horrible things, use of chemicals. Very, very, very unpleasant. And again, that has started with the Iraqis thinking that they would take out the Iranian Air Force. This is now it was the Imperial. It's now the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, the IRIAF. But again, they did so half-heartedly, really. They sent one wave of aircraft who came back and said, "Yep, we've done it." And so the second wave was cancelled. And the third, fourth and fifth waves that probably should have gone as well didn't. So in fact, it didn't really have much effect. And so you start off with quite an intense aerial warfare going on. But then, of course, because all the Iranian aircraft or Air Force aircraft are all American. They've got Phantoms, they've got Tomcats, they've got F-5 Freedom Fighters, but they don't have any spare parts. And a similar thing is true of the Iraqis, is they start running out of spare parts as well. So having a sort of very sort of fast and frantic sort of aerial warfare for the first few months, suddenly it all slows down, and they're trying to sort of husband their resources. And I guess it's really the Iraqis who, sort of about 83, 84, decide they're going to start taking out the tankers from the so-called tanker war starts. And again, that started with helicopters firing Exocet missiles, and then eventually they get some Super Étendards from the French, which are on loan, and they use those, and then eventually get these Mirage F1s that can carry them. So you end up with as the Iranians do really get forced to move their oil exports sort of further and further up the Gulf to try and keep out of the range of the Iraqi Air Force. And in the end, they end up with the world's biggest or largest tanker ever built is there as a sort of a floating oil terminal right at the mouth of the Gulf. And the Iraqis are flying these missions where they'll send off sort of 5 Mirages, of which one has got an Exocet and the other 4 have got fuel tanks, or buddy fuel tanks. So they then refuel each other down. These sort of long range strikes to take out shipping or Iranian registered ships, or shall I say ships that are buying Iranian oil. Meanwhile, the Iranians start trying to do the same thing to the tankers that are transporting Iraqi oil. Although that's mainly done by seaborne forces, so the air forces aren't really involved in that very much. But yeah,
I found that interesting, that the long range missions that were put together there.
Yeah, it's quite sophisticated, really.
It sort of reminded me a little bit of Black Buck.
Yes, well, it's very much so. Yes, on a slightly smaller scale. But it's basically the same sort of principle, really, isn't it? Of these massive armadas of tankers going out with a single bomber,
which neatly brings us into the Falklands. Yes. I think the Falklands. I distinctly remember being shocked that my country had gone to war. But followed it avidly on TV.
Yeah, I think we all did, didn't we?
Those funereal announcements from that guy at the Ministry of Defence.
Right, yes, it's completely deadpan,
who could have had a career as an undertaker.
Yes.
But, it was it was a war that Britain wasn't really prepared for. I mean, the Navy was in the process of being cut.
Yes, that's what caused it. I think largely because particularly it was when they got rid of it, endurance, or were going to announce they're going to. That's what persuaded the Argentinians really that the British weren't serious anymore. And you're absolutely right. I think Invincible was due to be sold to the Australians. The Vulcan bombers are all being cut up, literally smashed up at Waddington. They all the squadrons have been or about to be disbanded. Half of them had already gone. There were a few Sea Harriers, but it was not only the British who were unprepared, the Argentinians were unprepared as well, really. They kind of completely misread the situation, and particularly the Air Force. This is a fairly small Air Force, and it was designed to fight the war against Chile. So it was all short-range, Mirages, single-engine aircraft that you wouldn't want to fly vast distances over the sea. And these guys were used to doing, I guess, close air support type stuff over here for the army on the ground. Or fly across the mountains to Chile and go and bomb something, but they certainly had no idea about flying over the sea and no idea about how to attack a ship either. So these guys were dropped in it from a great height, and they also had to redeploy from their normal base up in northern Argentina right down to the south. It's really the sort of the war between the unprepared and the unprepared, really.
Yeah, and this is a very different war to the ones that you described before, because there really isn't a preemptive strike at all. Everybody knows where everybody's going to be. The Argentinians are waiting for the carriers to get down to the Falklands. It's predictable, but as you say, their air force is unprepared, and to some degree, the Royal Navy is saved by the Argentinians not being particularly good at fusing their bombs as well.
Yeah. Well, there's not it's not so much the fusing of the bombs. The issue is that if you drop, because they actually had British bombs, I think, and if you drop one of these things, it's got a clockwork fuse in it, literally a clockwork fuse, and it takes time for that to run down, and then the bomb goes bang when it hits something. But the time it takes to run down is basically you need to drop from probably about above 150 feet. So the guys were attacking these ships, and because they weren't used to that, firstly, I think they were quite amazed by the amount of firepower that's going back at them, but also they hadn't really thought through this business about what height do you drop these weapons from, and so they were dropping from ultra low level, hadn't they, 50 feet, something like that, and the things really didn't have an opportunity to fuse. Again, I mean, they obviously dropped them pretty accurately because there were a number of them went either straight through ships or actually lodged in them, and I think that was the case with a couple. I think it was Ardent. I think ended up getting blown up with a bomb that was being diffused in the back because it actually lodged in the back of the ship. I think the Argentinian pilots were incredibly brave and incredibly let down by their own command and control, but also they were pretty accurate when they did drop their weapons.
With the Vulcan, I mean, they were bringing these aircraft down to Ascension for this long range mission, but from what I understood, they were scrabbling around for spare parts for these things.
Well, yes, they're going out of service. So, they're scrabbling around for spare parts, but also they were looking at using the missile pylons that had been originally for the Skybolt missile, but to use them first to put a jammer, EW jammer on it, but also to put anti-radiation missiles on them. So I think although the first 2 Black Buck missions dropped free-fall bombs onto the airfield, the remaining ones were carrying Shrike missiles in order to take out the anti-aircraft radars down there. So, so first of all, they had to find these the pylons that had been sort of from this weapon that was cancelled in the early 1960s, and then stick them on. The aircraft were not, I think, in general equipped for air-to-air refuelling, so they had to sort all that lot out as well, and also to train the crews, because again, the crews hadn't done any air-to-air refuelling. So I think when they flew the missions, there was an extra crew member who was actually a Victor pilot, who was an air-to-air refuelling instructor, and I think he stood on the ladder between the 2 pilots, and sort of
said left a bit, right a bit.
Yes, yeah. So the whole thing was a remarkable piece of airmanship. I think, absolutely remarkable to have flown those distances, and actually to have dropped, quite accurately within the bounds of the equipment they had.
Yeah,
but whether it was any tactical use at all, I think is debatable. And obviously, the strategic impact of being able to drop those bombs was, and the PR impact and psychological impact was actually massive. But in terms of tactically being able to close the airfield, it didn't. Nor indeed did the Harrier and Sea Harrier raids either, because they didn't really have the weapons to do it properly in the same way that the Israelis had done.
But I guess the Harrier, and obviously we can't talk about the Falklands without mentioning the Harrier, was important from a air superiority.
I think it was, tremendously. Well, firstly, the Sea Harrier, and what those guys achieved was absolutely phenomenal, really. And they did not only fight very well, but also I think the aggressive way that they flew actually did frighten, if you like, or give them the psychological advantage as well. So it got to the stage where I think the Argentinian pilots were very, very worried about what the Sea Harriers might do, and I think there were a couple of occasions when guys did say, "Well, it's not worth going there. We'll drop our bombs and go home," rather than pressing and tagging with the Sea Harriers. The great sadness was actually that the Harriers of one squadron who were completely underused, because I think the guy who was the captain of Hermes he didn't like the RAF. So I think he thought it was more important to be thoroughly obnoxious towards the RAF, more important that than actually the fighting the Argentinians. So the Sea Harrier or the Harrier pilots, I think, were very frustrated that they weren't used properly, because again, I think had they been given the proper targets and things, they probably could have made a big difference. But they did actually. I think it's claimed that they sort of swung the balance during the Battle of Goose Green. The weather wasn't good enough for air support during most of the day, but in the evening, 2 Harriers pitched up and were able to take out some artillery that was holding down the parachute regiment. So, that they got laser guided weapons came much later on, but before they had the kit really to use them properly. But again, had that been the case, had they been able to be used properly, that would have made a difference as well, I think. Again, it's interesting to see how aircraft were used or not used. And really, as some might say, who made the least mistakes rather than who did the best, really.
But I think with the Falklands also, transportation is quite key there in terms of helicopter transportation, because with was the Atlantic Conveyor?
The Atlantic Conveyor, yes, that's right. That took out most of the helicopters, actually. So there was one Chinook who survived that. So that was that was put into overdrive. But also, the Royal Navy helicopters were used as well to very effectively. But actually, it's all those other bits. My background as a ground attack pilot, so I tend to sort of be rather biased that way. But when you look at all the support in terms of air-to-air refueling for the British side of it, for the using the Victors, which were tanker aircraft, also for maritime reconnaissance as well. because they did the long-range reconnaissance down to South Georgia before that was taken, and also the Nimrods that were doing maritime reconnaissance, making sure that the Argentinian Navy didn't come out. Also, the Argentinians themselves were flying Hercules into and out of Stanley, I think, right through the war at night time. Incredibly brave, really, and bringing in supplies, taking out wounded guys, bringing in and reinforcements, all that kind of stuff going on as well. It was aircraft or air power itself in all its guises did play a very important part in the whole of the conflict.
Michael, we could talk for hours.
Yeah.
The book is called Flashpoints, Air Warfare in the Cold War by Michael Napier. It's published by Osprey. There are links in the episode notes where you can buy the book, and there's the chance of winning a copy in our book giveaway, so do check out the details on that in the episode notes. Now, this podcast would not exist without our financial supporters, and I want to thank one and all of them for their generous support. If you want to help us, just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate for more information. And you can also join our Facebook group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Thanks very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye. Thanks for listening right through to the end. I really appreciate it. And maybe check out our store and see if you can find the ideal gift for the Cold War enthusiast in your life. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/store. Thanks for listening.